Here we go. Hello there. My name is Jay Frost, and if you've been to this party before, you know that I'm the host of the Philanthropy Mastermind series brought to you by DonorSearch. And if the setting looks different, it's because we are in a real place, and this is a real guest. This is not in my house in front of a bookcase, but rather at beautiful Strathmore, which is a music center in Bethesda, Maryland. And we'll probably talk a little bit about that at some point today, but I want to welcome you to the room. And we are still monitoring chat as best as we can from my oversized laptop here. So please do feel free to let us know that you're here. We would love to know that you're in the room with us, at least virtually, and we would love to hear from you. So please do use the chat as a way to just say howdy and talk with one another about whatever you feel like. But if you have a question, it'll be much easier, especially here, sitting at this table, to do that via the Q&A. So please do utilize the Q&A throughout, and thank you for warming that up, Frank, from Sierra Foothills. Please do use Q&A for any questions that occur to you, or maybe even comments that you want us to specifically address. Today's a big, sweeping subject with a guest who can address big, sweeping issues, as well as get into the nitty-gritty of how things work in the world of philanthropy, and that is Jim Langley. Jim, thank you so much for arranging for this room and for arranging time to talk.
You're most welcome, Jay. It's great to be with you.
It's great to be with you. And today we're going to be addressing a lot of things, but as I usually say, we will not be addressing DonorSearch, which is our sponsor for this whole series. They've been sponsoring this work back to 2016, over 500 programs. We are grateful to them for allowing me the privilege and the honor of being able to talk with people like Jim in real life. But if you want to learn more about DonorSearch, or your donors, and I hope you care about them, then just check them out over at DonorSearch.net. And while you're there, you can get a recording of this right after the fact that we posted under the resources tab, along with dozens of other sessions throughout the year and our schedule of events coming up in the weeks ahead. There are going to be dozens and dozens of programs this year, all built around your needs and interests. That's all at DonorSearch.net. And so with that, our subject today is one that you framed with the world's best title. So I'm going to read it word for word so I don't get it wrong. And that's what philanthropic leaders will be called increasingly to do. And then you use these three phrases, which is how we built this. And that's absorb chaos, project calm, and give hope. Before we dive into that subject, I want to give people just a very brief thumbnail sketch about you. And you've been in the field for a number of years.
Yes.
You've run massive campaigns at Georgetown,
yes.
Over at Georgia
Tech,
Georgia Tech, and also at UCSD, I believe it was.
Correct.
So in each of those settings, whether it was as vice president or vice chancellor, you've overseen the growth of a program, and much of that, it sounds like to me, was predicated on a thing that I love, and I know that you've talked about here in this titling, which is listening as one of the primary mechanisms we have to make sure that what we're doing is in tune with the needs of our donors and our projects, both of those things. And I think that's where we started this conversation on LinkedIn. So with that, can you talk a bit about where that idea came from, this idea that leaders need to absorb chaos, project calm, and give hope?
I heard that definition years ago, 6 words, and I couldn't find the source of it, nor could the person who shared it with me, but he said, "Don't you like it?" I says, "Well, it's perfect." And then I started to think about either current leaders or leaders in history who I admired, and that's exactly what I thought they did. And at these epochal moments, they were able to step into the breach and generate that calm. And what made them so impressive was how chaotic the world was around them. And because I think we are in a cycle in which we are rethinking at every level who we are, how we behave, how we interact with one another, how we work, what constitutes work. We are going through more change. When I look at the totality of change, I see us moving into another epoch, and that means that very often you go into a kind of a degenerative cycle. Don't mean that as an aspersion, but in other words, the things you used to do fall apart as you start to invent new ways of being. And there's much about fundraising and philanthropy that I was acculturated to that is not working. In some cases is falling apart. In other words, change is outstripping it, and I worry that we're not keeping pace with it, and there will be consequences for good causes if they don't understand how profound these dynamics are. And so when I proposed that title, I thought it was apt, given the rapidity of change. It's as if we're in our little boats, all thinking that's our existence, and we're not seeing the massive tides under us that are taking us to a very different place. And so I do care about the perpetuation of good causes, but I think they will have to behave differently going forward than they've behaved in the past. And then to be frank about it, while I'm caring and I understand this aspect of human nature, I see nonprofits often behaving as if they are victims of circumstance. And I cited someone in a recent post who used that phrase 11, 12 years ago. So the world changes. People feel the good they used to do can't be done as easily, efficaciously as it once was. Money isn't as easy to raise. They hear about these big gifts elsewhere, and they start to feel some injustice is occurring, and they start to plead. And when you start to plead, you position yourself for alms, you act like a charity, and you will then be seen as a wobbly enterprise that will scare away this new emerging targeted investor who wants underpinning strength as a precondition to make a larger investment.
There is so much in what you just said. So I'm wondering which layer we start with. This isn't the typical onion. I feel like we have to cut it in half and start from the center. All right. So let's talk first about those undercurrents.
Yes.
I don't want to assume that we're all on the same page about everything that's wrong in the world. So what are some of the things that are the waves that are crashing against us, that are kind of wiping away our shoreline of the nonprofit sector?
The most obvious, and the one that's been pounding away at us the longest, is the decline in giving households.
Okay.
And that would be true in the United States, and that's true in other places to the extent that we can ascertain it. And guess what? Wherever you see significant philanthropy is where you see democracy. So philanthropy, as we know it, that is the giving to institutions and the trust in institutions, is a function of democratic cultures. When democracy becomes strained, it also reverberates elsewhere. So we can talk about trust, if you'd like, somewhere else. But it's this decline in giving households. So that isn't something going wrong. What that is people redirecting their philanthropic impulse in areas that they know interpersonally. So for instance, take someone who once supported higher learning, that then has decided to put their grandchildren through college because the cost is so high. Their children, they feel, didn't have as many earning opportunities as they did. So I would argue they're still very much philanthropic, but that philanthropy is not going to institutions. For young people, that philanthropy is going less and less to institutions, or they're not claiming tax credits for it, because they're much more affected by peer testimony. So a person younger than a boomer would hear about a friend who's having an operation and their insurance can't cover the total cost. So they do a little crowdfunding to augment the cost. They know the person, they lend their name to a friend's cause. And so people will continue to be philanthropic, but more interpersonally, more locally, and they will give more to people that they know and trust, and they will give where they can see an impact and feel a part of a community. That's what looks like what's happening. So if you're an institution doing good things in a good cause, you've got to look less like an institution, and you've got to get into the community and get known. You've got to get out of the fortress, out of the headquarters, and you've got to reestablish a local presence.
Well, there are lots of arguments for doing that right now, and especially out west in the community center philanthropy movement. But before we tackle that, because that's another beehive potentially, at least on the language we use around that subject, one of the things that strikes me as you're kind of dissecting some of this is that you don't seem to be judging it. when we've had these conversations, we meaning all of us in the sector, but when I've had these conversations with you or you've had them with others on places like LinkedIn, there's been sometimes a very visceral reaction, as if these observations are either criticisms or you're making a judgment about the value of these actions. And crowdfunding is a great example of this. Some people say, well, crowdfunding is an opportunity for democratization of philanthropy. The fact that it isn't measured fully by Giving USA or whatever doesn't mean anything. It's happening. People are giving. Someone else says, well, it's showing that there's a lack of trust in institutions. These are different observations. So first, I want to make sure I'm checking myself. Are you making a judgment as to whether or not a growth of more grassroots-oriented fundraising is a good or a bad thing, or are you just observing?
I'm observing, and I think that's my discipline, and that is the service that I provide to my clients and to my field, is to look at the world as it is and not as I would like it to be, and then say it is the world that, if this is the way it is, then this is the world we must navigate and we must intersect. If we resist growing inexorable, palpable change and wish it away and wish a return to the past, the strategist in me, the guide in me, the scout in me gets very worried about where this place is going, because these are the new realities. And I think that's so critical, Jay, is to see the new realities, is to look into the horizon, look deep into the landscape, and say where we came from is not where we are now or where we will be going forward. We can preserve some of who we are, some of our ways of being, but there are a series of adjustments to be made. It only stands to reason that the more rapid the pace of change, which we're all seeing, which we're all experiencing, the more rapid the rate of adaptation if we hope to keep up, maintain our relevance, and inspire others to support us. So I do see this, which is human nature. For some of us, is this resistance to change, and it seems to me that calls others of us to herald change, to help people navigate it, and to try to do that in the most polite, tactful way, but with a degree of urgency.
But even in that word choice, that's a very thoughtful word choice. You're heralding change. That's not necessarily the same thing as advocating for change.
That's right. That's right.
So when it comes to, and there are many things we can talk about today, but when it comes to working with clients, for example, which is just one part of your life,
yes,
and they want to do something,
yes,
and you can imagine another way of doing it that might help them a little bit more,
yes.
Where does that line between just observation and advocacy,
yes.
Where does it go?
That's a great question. Well, you try to hold a mirror up, and it's not your judgment, it's not your hunch, right. It's not your opinion, it's a mirror, and it's a mirror of fact as you have been able to gather it. And so you try to observe, you try to quantify, crystallize, and say, don't you see this? So a quick example would be higher education, enrollment. There's a demographic decline, a certain one coming in 25, 26, because there was an 18% decline in the birth rate in 2008. So we know it. Now, a couple surprises occurred along the way. Is that more and more young people of college age and college eligible started to say, no, I'm not so sure. Some of them said, I think I'll wait a while. Coming out of COVID, a larger quotient than anyone realized said, no, I'm not sure this is my future. I'm not sure the cost is worth the reward.
Right.
I'm not justifying that, but I have to report to my clients, that's how they feel. So whatever assumptions you had about the demographic cliff, now it looks more perilous. Yeah. And now you have to say, going into 25, 26, if you have any weaknesses, then they will be exacerbated. What you thought was an 18% decline in enrollment could be much greater than that. But that seems to me the only responsible thing to do. And then people will say, again, one has to be both accurate and loving. People will say, well, do we have to use such sort of doom and gloom language? And I go, you call it whatever you want. Let's call it an 18% decline. That's a big chunk.
It's a number.
We can't wash the 18% away. You can characterize it any way you want. Let me call it consequential.
This is, I mean, Okay, so this reminds me of something else which came up recently, and I say this with a lot of affection because I like people who
Sure.
made both of these statements.
Of course.
So we're hearing from some, especially within the world of Giving Tuesday,
Yeah.
which has seen just dramatic growth. But some people might say that they're moving the goalpost by saying, well, yeah, giving as a population might have been in decline, but that's only because you're not measuring all these other things like crowdfunding. And I'm wondering when well, we've seen it in higher ed too with measuring giving numbers, right? Where people will say, well, our giving rates are up, but that's because we're also not counting the people that have fallen off the cliff already, that have not, been participating for a while. So even in these numbers, I'll bet there's room for argument as people say, well, this 18%, is that the right thing we're measuring? So when it comes to that, how do you tackle that discussion?
Yes, of course, there's always room for argument, and none of us can be so arrogant that we say, we know the absolute truth. We can say how we got to those numbers, right? So we know those numbers because institutions report them. We know those numbers because people claim tax credits for them, so we quantify where we can. As I said at the outset, though, we do know some people are going off the grid. Now, you can say that doesn't count, but you see, we've always characterized philanthropy in our field as giving to institutions, not giving interpersonally. So you go, well, that doesn't count. And I'm going to say, but it counts on your books. It's wonderful that people remain philanthropic, but you as an institution need to worry about the outmigration from institutional giving to something that looks more interpersonal and community-based.
So let me dive into that with you for a minute, because that's one of the things you said at the outset, that this is, you didn't use the words clear and present danger. That's more my kind of radical adjectival use. But if we are seeing, and we know it, we know that the percentage of people who give in the United States has declined.
30% in 30 years.
Which is huge.
Huge.
So if it was 3/4 of the people and now it's half, or roughly, so is that how do I ask you if it's a good or bad thing without asking you to make a judgment? I mean, let me ask it differently. Why is that necessarily a risk? If those who say, well, no, there's more informal giving going on, if they're right, if there's a way to measure that, I'm not sure, but let's assume that there is. And we know that there's been under-measurement, for example, among different ethnicities, non-white population for a long time. For sure. In part because the people on the institutional fundraising side didn't acquire, cultivate, solicit, involve, engage, all these things with those populations. We ignored them, meaning people who look like me.
Right.
That's hopefully changing, but it's taking forever to get there. So in the meantime, if we're starting to measure that, well, is that the wrong thing? Is it wrong to say that institutions have to be the agent of change?
Yeah, there was so much there. So you can't poo-poo a mega trend by saying, I think a lot of micro trends will compensate for it, when the micro trends don't look like they together come close to approximating what's happening with them. So you may have 2, 3, 4, 5% that we missed here or there, but that 30% decline, and it's measured both by people dying, right, of older generations who were highly philanthropic, the silent generation, and the older edges of the baby boomers, but also by the fact that younger generations are not coming in the same way that earlier generations did. So it's both a loss through attrition, through death, and a lack of participation coming in that adds up to that total. But Jay, what we do is to look into clients' data over and over and over again and compare megatrends with institutional data. It is extraordinarily rare. I mean, I'd have to struggle to find 1 or 2 instances in the last 12 years where we haven't seen an institution suffering an overall loss of donors. Second, we see that being masked by fewer, older, wealthier donors giving larger amounts. When we apply actuarial tables to those that they are now increasingly dependent on, we say we can't predict when, but in 10 years, you could be seeing significant declines in your giving if we don't think about intervening strategies, including other sources of revenue that wouldn't be philanthropic. That, in other words, maybe philanthropy will only be a part of the solution, but if you remain utterly dependent on this, you're going to start to see a real crumbling. I may be wrong, but I'll put it on record from everything I can see in higher education that this year, when the numbers come in February and March, we will see an absolute decline in total giving to American higher education.
Okay, and I want to just put a pin in that, because much of what we're talking about might sound abstract, but it's not.
No.
So if there's a decline in giving to education, we also are going to be looking at numbers of perhaps a decline in the people who are matriculating. We're going to see a significant impact potentially on private colleges versus public institutions. Right. There are lots of different things here, and I know we can get into that spaghetti and get lost forever. But the bottom line is pretty savage for institutions that rely on that in order to provide an education.
And what people don't understand is, the quote that I think is most instructive, and it's germane to our discussion, John Kenneth Galbraith saying, "The revolution kicks down an already rotted door." What he's saying is what we keep saying happens suddenly, happens slowly, and we didn't pay attention to it.
Right.
Sound familiar? And so when something cataclysmic happens, we will say that we would be startled by it. But, the Cassandras who were given the gift of prophecy but doomed never to be believed will then say, but we've been saying that for 20 years, and I will probably be one of those, right? So you can't ever say when, but you can say it's adding up, and you can also know that there are tipping points. And there might come a point where certain generations simply, by and large, start to dismiss known institutions and say, no, we're going to create our own at a local level.
Well, sure. Aren't we seeing that already?
We're seeing that, but
wealthy individuals setting up these, whether it's private foundations, their own organizations, or yes, exactly.
The much criticized DAF
right.
is really the average person's way of thinking strategically about their philanthropy, of setting it aside, and then determining how to manage it. It's been much maligned, and some of the criticism has been refuted by studies that, it's just wealthy people locking up massive amounts of money with non-philanthropic intent. Well, it's a case where we need to look at the data, not just respond to the fear that that's what's happening. That's happening in some cases, but the average DAF user is not the multi-millionaire. It's the person who might be giving away between 10 and 100,000. I'll have to check my data. But what I keep hearing from, because I have raised questions about, are we using too many sweeping generalizations about DAFs, from people saying, I have one, colleagues. No one reaches out to me, even though I declare I have a DAF and that they are one of the potential fundees. No one then responds to me. So now you have the average person acting like a foundation. I know who I am. I've established giving guidelines. I've parked money here. I will invite proposals, and it's crickets.
And why is that? Why is it that they're being essentially ignored by the institutions who supposedly see them as supporters, as friends, as family?
I wish I knew. Because, remember Willie Sutton is, why do you rob banks? It's because the money is. Right. So we're in the fundraising business. They're now moving into DAFs. We should be studying DAFs, not imputing negative motives to, they may, you can do whatever you want interpersonally, sure, but it's not good fundraising policy. If you care about the cause you're representing, you then go, money is going there. How do we access it? And the more you look at it, the more you see it's like an individual acting like a foundation. So I would then plead with my clients, use these kinds of formats in my writing to say, as sources dry up, as some fundraising activities prove fruitful, please make sure you're looking at DAFs. You're pulling, the 990s, and you're looking in your community. You're seeing who set them up. You're seeing what their designations are, or their characterizations of those funds. because there appear to be any number of missed opportunities from what I can gather. So you're listening to this mega criticism about those nasty wealthy people, but you got money in your own community foundations that either is directly reachable or approximate the causes that you're representing. And those people are wondering why they're not hearing from you. Those DAF holders are wondering why they're not hearing from you.
I know this is almost a perfect time to then start talking about how do leaders confront these issues, which is, I know the point of this, at least how we advertised it, although I'm loving this discussion, I hope you are too. But I do want to see if there's anything that's come in from the audience that we can address and weave in. So if you've been chatting, we haven't been ignoring you, we've just been having too much fun. So blame me, don't blame Jim. So we do have a comment here, and it showed up in the comments rather than the questions. If we have missed a question in the chat, please pop it over in the Q&A. But that was from Joe. So thank you, Joe, for being here today, who said, who gave an answer to Bob, who had said, DAF seem to have an opaque screen between the donor and potential recipients. How do you reach out to them so that they hear from you? Do you have thoughts on how to make that a little easier so that if those who are actually willing to go out to DAF holders and talk to them might know who they are?
Well, some of the DAF holders tell me that they then notify institutions that they are being considered and they don't hear. Mm-hmm. You could go and ask your head of your community foundation if they have any advice or if there's any way that you could intersect with them and their DAF holders. And so I would look at those strategies. I think it's a very good question, and I will try to do more work on that and in future writings try to share that. I know that they can be, but the instrument requires that it's a hands-off arrangement. In other words, they park the money and then they advise as to how it is expended, or, right, it's not a direct pass-through, it's not direct give it. And so it seems to me that is discernible in different ways. And I've been told that some people on the 990 will be specific as to what the DAF is set up for.
There is also, I know, some effort by some vendors to address this. I know that one service is Definitive, that's been developed by Helen Brown Group.
Enterprise.
But it is challenging. But it seems like some people, like of course Bob here, are trying to address this when they know, but others are not at all. And in fact, you could even ask people in a survey, couldn't you? I mean, right now we're saying here's a way you can be involved in your estate plan. Yeah. Well, if we're doing that, why not ask them if they have a DAF?
And I love surveys. I love survey because they're great for listening. So, look at donors of the last couple of years and run a survey out to them, say, any of you working from DAFs, and how can we better work with you, right?
I'm trying to remember the last time I received a survey from any organization that I know.
And this is what we are advising clients all the time is listen, ask any way you can.
Right.
Ask in the name of stewardship, conduct annual stewardship interviews with your top donors, send out polls to mid-range donors, use your annual fund techniques to listen, right? Turn everything that was once a one-way vehicle of communication into an interactive one.
Okay, and that probably is a great segue into this issue about leadership, because I'm not sure how well we're doing that. But just before we go there, I know there are some other questions here. Sure. Ashley had asked if this is being recorded and emailed. It's not being emailed to you, but you can get a copy over at DonorSearch.net, where the Library of Philanthropy Mastermind sessions are housed. So please do look there for this and other sessions. We also had a comment from an anonymous attendee, always the scariest thing, because I don't know who anonymous is, but they keep showing up, who said, when you talked about the major undercurrents, to me, the two largest undercurrents have been brewing for decades, and I think you'd agree with that, and are finally surfacing and being recognized as in realism in such areas as rising insurance rates that acknowledge them, the realities of climate change, societal healing and reconfiguration required to address systemic institutionalized racism. I'm only laughing because we talked about these things even before the session, not because they're not serious, they're very serious, but there are so many.
There's so many.
And so, so maybe this is a good transition.
I agree completely that is a part of what I was trying to describe is everything is being turned upside down. Everything is being questioned, including, historic injustice. What constitutes participation in a society? How do we overcome, structural inhibitors to, if not out and out resistance or bigotry? All those things are churning. and they're adding up to this massive amount of change. I mean, to the point made, which I completely second. Then we have to add all those up and say, how are they playing out in various regions? How are they playing out according to which cause or institution is being represented? But for instance, in the last couple of years doing feasibility studies, very often I will go interview people who are running foundations that will have something to do with social justice, right? And my client thinks that they can compete for those funds. And I go in and say, just remind you, I'm here for this client. And the first thing the person does from that foundation is open up their laptop and look at the composition of the executive team in that organization and look at the composition of their board and says to me, please tell your client, I don't see any representation at the top of your organizations. I can only question how committed are you? So not only are people questioning, they're pushing back, they're doing more due diligence than ever before. They're calling you on your claims and maybe even calling some bluffs. Don't just come to me capturing phrases. I'm going to check out whether you're walking the talk.
This is we talk a lot about authenticity. We don't often measure it. And that's a very clear way to do it. And we haven't seen much movement of that needle about diversity among really the three big areas, right? The board, the staff, and the donor pool.
Right.
And if you don't, all three of those things are linked. Right. So,
right.
But this is really
it's like important. Every construct of the past, which were the sort of necessary organizing principles of the past, are now seen as limiting factors to the future, right? And so I think this is healthy, but of course, you want to question, but not throw babies out with bathwater. But I think this wholesale questioning of how we organize ourselves as a society up to this point is very healthy.
So this is where the leader comes in.
This is where the leader then can't be threatened by this widespread questioning, this let's throw everything up in the air and rethink who we are, how we organize, how we coexist, what's fair, what's just, that leader then has to say, one, understand there's great opportunity to lead because we're searching for better ways.
So what does that look like in practical terms? Do you have a leader who's asking lots of questions, doing an inventory continually, or are they coming in there and they pushing for these things? What are you seeing as the most effective, or does it vary from institution to institution?
Well, no, I have to say again, both, through long experience working with a lot of clients, doing a lot of research, and as a student of history, change comes from listening. That this now is the most important requirement for institutional leaders. Is I teasingly characterize the old way of getting behind closed doors, imagining better ways in splendid isolation, than springing in on the unsuspecting and asking them to support it. Now, the inverse must happen is you must listen, you must do needs assessment, you must be in community, you must gather evidence and then bring it in and say, how do we respond? What are our capabilities to respond? So you're not going to cook up fundraising ideas inside and spring them out. You're going to come up with your best fundraising ideas by circling, listening, aggregating, and then responding. You're going to do your best leadership by realizing your great challenge is to build coalitions of threads. That you're going to have to be a weaver of strands because we've segmented as a society. And again, some of the questions suggest this. I think it's healthy because when we don't trust big things, we get down to the thread that defines us. I am this. I am that. This is my animating purpose, right? And this is good because big failed. So now we create small that works for us. We create kindred spirits. So to build any kind of coalition, and coalitions are necessary to bring about change, and let's just take social justice as a desired change, everybody, I think, to some extent, would agree that there are any number of injustices. We might argue which ones they are, and they need to be addressed if we are to be a healthier, more whole, more efficacious society that gets things done. All right, so you now have to build coalitions of various stakeholders. You have to be a little bit like Tip O'Neill than Lee Iacocca. You've got to be a different kind of character that goes, oh my goodness, I'm working now in a democracy made up of a lot of threads, and those threads are asserting themselves, and those threads are insistent that, I'm not going to go back to the way I was, and I don't want the past to be predictive of my future. So you then have to find out what they have in common and get them to see the commonalities with each other. This is a real skill, but it requires deep listening, deep emotional intelligence, real empathy. So when you're dealing with people and asking them to come in and start forming coalitions, they believe in you. They see conviction. They see gravitas in you. And Jay, I don't think you can do that. And I can speak from some experience. They don't feel heard, and heard, not just the words they said, but resonance with them. If you don't convey it touched your soul, they don't come on board.
Many of the examples you just used sound like they were an inventory of all those fibers in the fabric surrounding us, but that's also true internally, right? I mean, if you're a new leader at an organization, large or small, and there are fractures within that too, we've seen them many times, does the leader have to do that, employ that same process in order to bring people together?
Yeah. So again, we've taken so much for granted, right? We've literally got to start interviewing our own staff and finding out what gets them up in the morning.
Right.
Do they feel valued? Do they feel they fit? We throw people into these environments and then wonder why they leave. And we know that very often it's a absence of belonging, that they never were properly onboarded. They never felt as if they were admitted in and validated, right? So you got to go back to something that's, wait a second, take nothing for granted. Years ago, I can't remember how many, Peter Drucker, who was highly influential in my thinking, said, as we move into a kind of a creative society, you're going to treat the creative worker like a volunteer. And everybody went, what does that mean? They still have to work. They've got to show up. Wow. But you're running an advancement operation right now. I think you're starting to know what treating people like a volunteer is. They can go anywhere. They can do anything. They're looking at who's going to give them the most flexibility. You want talent.
Right.
You better treat them like a volunteer.
I'm only reacting right now this way because I'm hearing some of that current come back. So right before, right at the entry into the pandemic, there was this whole discussion about how, we got to change all these processes so people can work, but we have to start recognizing that people are in some form of pain. It's either physical pain or societal pain. We had the murder of George Floyd. Lots of different things happened, but very recently. It reminds me of an article from Medium from April of 2020, which said, just wait because it's going to be the gaslighting and they'll say it never happened. And I've just been reading articles about how people are saying, you got to come back to the office. And the latest one, I think today, was Disney. And people saying, you've got to come back in and you got to work here. And we're starting to hear echoes of that even in our sector. And the front of the Chronicle of Philanthropy right now is there unionization coming to our sector? Now, I don't know that we need to talk about each of these issues, but rather maybe is leadership listening right now? Because if they're trying to get people to go back to what they think was the way of doing things, is that a representation of an old leadership style, or is it people just trying to make sure that things work? I mean, to be fair, maybe they're just trying to make things work.
Well, what is leadership without talent? And right, so. What are you leading, right? And so if I'm a leader, and it did characterize me, even when there weren't open positions, I was always looking. One reason I went for a conference is I want to know what talent was out there. I was always looking for talent. It was an ongoing. So if you're an organization who wants to compete, much less compete, it will be competition for talent. When talent starts to move, dry up, behave differently, you can talk all kinds of theories you want, but my leadership style and the leadership style I will advocate is bend to accommodate talent. And if talent, and if you look at, let's say, 5 frontline fundraising positions, and the 5 top people are all asking for flexibility, I'm not going to go with the theory of HR. I'm going to go with the reality of the people in front of me.
That also sounds like it would work all the way across the spectrum, right? Whether you're a board member talking to your executive director, or whether you're the executive director talking to somebody who's working at the reception desk,
Right.
that we'd better, again, bend to where the talent is, because otherwise, why do they have to stick around? They don't have to be there, right?
And by the time you figure it out, talent has fled to someplace else.
And that's very costly.
Incredibly costly. So you lost the people who you were looking at as potential workers, and then you lost people within, and they're all looking for new paradigms
Right.
that are more satisfying, where they can do more soulful work, where they can be true to their own scruples. These are very powerful factors. Everybody, well, they just want to be at home to wear their pajamas. It's not, again, the dismissive things that we hear do a real injustice to everyone,
Right.
and are offensive to anybody. For instance, one of the reasons that there was a study that I read, I didn't do, but I thought it was great, that why don't people ask more often? Are development officers timid? Turns out a lot of them are scrupulous. They don't ask because they don't think the institution can deliver on what's being asked to do.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that is so true, but that's unspoken. I mean, that's largely
It just
unspoken.
got said, didn't it?
I want to make sure that I don't, in the spirit of listening, that I practice
You and I
what
are dangerous.
you
We
are
gotta-
preaching. So, okay, so we have a whole bunch of notes here, and I
Oh,
want to
good.
thank you for that. So Kara had said, in some cases, people might choose to establish a DAF. This is back to the DAFs, but I think they're
good.
representative of much of this conversation.
Yeah.
And about really about agency, right, among
Yes.
donors. So choose to establish a DAF since they can remain anonymous and not get pitched.
Yeah,
And
that's true. So there we go.
they don't trust.
Right.
So they want to have their own ability to set up their own thing, and then when they're ready, they
Right.
can do what they want on their terms.
And it is, they want to get pitched on their own terms, which then tells us the net effect of what so many development officers have been browbeaten and
Right.
flogged to do for the last 25 years is ask, more.
Right.
And guess what? There was a consequence to that, which is, no, thank you. I'll invite you in. You make the pitch when I give you the cue.
So it sounds like you're also advocating for something that, the smaller, more focused portfolios. Wow, that's a first
And
time
I'm
that's happened.
advocating for asking permission before you ever ask anybody for a gift. Right?
Yes.
Yeah, and being much more sensitive on the approach and much less presumptuous, and putting the prospect in charge. We're advocating, you and I, our school of thought, lots of colleagues out there. I'm a spokesperson for them. We've been advocating this for a long period of time, and we've proven that it works when you employ two principles: preview, permission. I'm sending you this. This is what I want to talk to you about. This will be the only agenda. And then when you're there, may I come back with this? No sneaking, no bombarding, no ambushing, no nothing, because that, I think, the DAF user is hiding from. So I realize we haven't figured it out. I certainly haven't figured it out where I'm saying get in front of them, but this is a very legitimate point. I did hear this, that no, I want this done on my terms. But I still think there will come a point where the DAF holder will say, I like what you're doing, come in. So the question is the survey or some different approach that says, how do we compete with DAF holders? Could you direct us? Could you guide us? If we seem to cross, our capabilities seem to cross what you think is important to achieve, we have specialists who will sit down and listen to you and customize the approach that you dictate to us.
This requires that calm that you're talking about. Again, the title, Projecting
Yes.
Calm, which that isn't to say that there isn't a certain amount of adrenaline or fear if we know there's a goal at the end of the year, this quarter, and we know we need to raise the money because otherwise people don't eat, cancer patients don't get treatment, whatever it is that we do.
Right.
But if we are running around like, in desperation, that goes back to the, searching for alms versus
That's right.
building partnerships.
It
with
does.
philanthropy.
And then remember, the last one is to give hope, and that is in what we ask for.
Right.
It isn't subsidization. Again, people will quarrel with me about the word. It's fine. You feel free to quarrel with me, but I'm trying to summarize what I'm hearing from hundreds and hundreds of donors. I'm talking to them on a regular basis.
Mm-hmm.
I'm interviewing them. I don't want to underwrite operations. I want to invest in the healthiest part. I want somebody to tell me where the leverage is. I want them to show me what's working, right? So we've gotten into this thing that in some cases where desperation creeps in and, we must have this, we have these needs. There's no hope giving in that. The hope giving is if we are able to secure this amount, we can help 3% more people, or we can improve the service to people most deserving of it. That's a much different tone than the plead, the desperation. You've got to give hope that no matter how hard we struggle, we keep looking for these differences. We keep gathering data, understand where we're having an impact, and where we see a glimmer of impact, we want to double down and want you to join us. Most sophisticated donors know these are experiments, but they want to be brought in to the experiment to know there's a structure to it and that we're trying to determine what works and what doesn't work, not just say, this is what's being rejected. I'm the expert here.
Oh, right.
You give us the money and we'll figure it out. They're going, no, show me the math.
Right, and that's not just the ultra wealthy rejecting. No. That's also somebody for $25, right? I mean, everybody feels that way.
It's a rising tide.
Nobody wants to be sold.
Show me the math.
Right. So, it's interesting. One part of this came up on LinkedIn again. I think it was just today. So this seems to be an ad for LinkedIn.
Which I think is a great agora. I mean, I'm all for it. Join Jay on LinkedIn. We're having great conversations.
Those are great conversations. They're more substantive than some of the other places which have become, less productive. But there was a conversation about this issue about overhead.
Yes.
And that's a conversation we're always having.
Yes.
But I think that something attributed to you, I'm not sure if you actually said this or people are just saying it's you, is this idea that if you do have this kind of true permission-based approach where you're in partnership with people, where they're part of the experiment that you're doing, then they might be less resistant to helping to finance the thing that makes that project possible. So if it's a building, it costs something to build the road to the building, and so that's part of your overhead, sure, but we're the people behind the building of the road.
We took out the overhead and tried to sell it by itself. All I'm saying is put the overhead in the difference to be made. Don't label it as all overhead, label it as the cost of business to achieve X, Y, or Z. But Jay, I'm a frontline fundraiser. I developed a reputation for bringing in very large gifts. They quarrel about gift fees, they quarrel about overhead, but if you say it cost X to achieve these purposes,
that's just honest.
They don't fly spec the budget. They go, okay.
Right.
Because what they like is you've projected the difference to be made.
So
you've quantified the difference. We keep breaking out overhead and not quantifying differences and going, why aren't you buying the dullest, highest risk portion of what we do? And if you're in fundraising, if you're in the nonprofit world and you're not projecting what more money would do this year versus last year, you're going to just be losing traction over and over again. You're going to get small gifts in.
Sure.
People won't see movement, won't see difference made, and they'll fall out.
So why is it that so many of our organizations in the nonprofit world are obsessed with unrestricted revenue? That they say, no, we're just going to go for unrestricted dollars. Why can't they have a relationship where it's just always a part of the package of the donation?
So that's what I characterize as a needle in the haystack campaign. You want an unrestricted campaign? So you're going to take all your fundraising talent, all your fundraising resources, and put it in pursuit of the least likely thing to occur. Good for you. Now that makes a lot of sense. Why not take your resources and apply them where you're going to get the greatest return? So again, this is what leads to turnover. Fundraisers go get unrestricted income. They're getting rebuffed and rejected constantly. The data says it's disappearing. It's been disappearing. It's been in constant decline for 20 years. And the fundraiser is then stuck delivering a message one way and not being able to get, the donor says, well, go back and tell them this. And the fundraiser can't broker the difference between the two. The fundraiser goes, I can't do what my organization wants, and they won't listen to the people I'm trying to raise money from. Right. Therefore, this is untenable. And this happens a lot.
So where does the leader address this issue, which seems like it's very much specific to fundraising, but it's not really, is it? I mean, because this is about the way we run the organization. It's about our relationships with all the people who support us. It's about what we do within the community. how does a leader address something so basic as
Well,
this?
to Anonymous, maybe this is at the heart of everything that's going on. Maybe this is a rebellion against a non-listening authority. Maybe we're saying a wholesale, widespread rebellion against, I'm an authority, I'm an expert, this is what we need. Maybe that's the great assault, but it's taking different forms. And so, that can then be responsible for injustice, that can be responsible for, all kinds of inability to adapt, to adjust, to keep up with need, to improve the human condition where it needs most improving. Maybe that's it. But you can then start to see that the listening leader is going to do better and better, and the non-listening leader will fall behind. So some people will say the market will take care of it. You can believe what you want, but the market will respond to the listener and rebuff the non-listener. Unfortunately, if the non-listener is representing a good cause, that's tragic. But it's there, and it's pervasive, and a lot of people are frustrated by it. I just think we've got to redefine what leadership is.
Right.
And some people aren't ready to do that.
I'm going to hop back to the audience, if I may, and see if there's something else brewing out here that I've missed. There were more things about DAFs, so it just shows that's still a very hot topic.
I want to learn, so I hope we can review those comments. And we need to create more conversations about what's really going on, and then how do we work gracefully with those DAF holders?
Especially since that's just one way that people are putting it, the flag down and saying that I have the ability to make a choice about how I give my gift, whether that gift is $10 or $10 million. And another question, which is, how can we convey hope without promising growth, or help more people when growth is not always the mission?
Well, then it's qualitative improvements. It's improvement in the quality of life, in the human condition. And then you have to make that case that we have decided not to grow, but to improve. And here's the population that we serve, and this is how we think we can improve delivery to them for whatever reason. So I think it's a very fine argument, and I think there are any number of donors who would say, I like that. Now, anytime you can't grow, you will open up opportunities for others to then come into that space. But again, I think that's a market dynamic, and that's fine. I think it's far wiser to delimit what you can do and do well and do authentically than to keep juggling more balls and doing everything more poorly.
Sure. As you're talking through all this with me, and we're revisiting each piece, each layer, I think in terms of the leadership conversation, one place we haven't talked about much, and I hope this is of interest to everybody in this room together, is leadership within our sector. If it's one thing if we say that a leader, this is very derivative of everything you're sharing, but if a leader listens, and that's one way to help an organization to be better in terms of delivery or better in terms of growth or both, to be more in touch with the community than you've been, all those things are I definitely believe everything you've said. That's one person, one organization. We have a sector which, as we talked about before, keeps stumbling over itself in many of these ways. Thinking, communicating intentionally or not, that we know better than you do, that we're going to do it this way, it's that way or the highway, and what we ask for and how we ask. What kind of leadership do we need in our sector so we can improve as a whole, so that rising tide, more donors will lift all boats?
Yeah. Well, again, great question. Given our conversation, I would say talent obsessed leaders. Because if you start there and you go back to Peter Drucker saying you're gonna have to treat them like volunteers, what do you do with a volunteer? Listen, co-create, accommodate. Now, you still have to be a leader, and so you can be the total consensus builder who ducks every tough decision, or you can say everybody gets a voice, but not everybody gets a vote. I'll decide, but I listen, I'll weave the threads together as well as I could, and then decide this is where we go. And I think the vast majority of people I know that I've talked to said, oh, that's exactly right. We don't want a leader saying, you decide and we'll do what the group thinks. Then what's your job? right? But we want an authentic listener who is genuinely trying to weave those threads and improve us as he or she improves delivery. What gives you faith in a leader is he or she is trying to make me better. They're trying to develop my career well beyond this job, maybe even this place. Because that's the leader at this age I look back on and say, thank God I had exposure to them. They cared about my future. They made an investment in my future, which I carried well beyond that place. But it was wonderful because I felt so committed to them while they were there. So I'd say a talent-obsessed leader is what we need. And you can't manage talent without understanding the individuality of talent. John Wooten is rumored to have said, when somebody said, noticed him behaving differently with different basketball players, you have a different standard with, I think his name was Lou Alcindor at the time before he became Green. And Wooten said, I have 12 basketball players, I have 12 different standards. They're all individuals. Mm-hmm. Now think about, how we all come into the workplace with different backgrounds, different degrees of trauma, of struggle, of adversity in our lives, different degrees of emotional woundedness, different all those things that show me a driven person, and I'll show you a wound somewhere in there. Yeah. People just, he's really disciplined. No, she's really disciplined. No, there's something deeper there that we need to understand and respect. So we want to make them productive, but nurture the wound. So I think, the leader, if the leader just says, I want the best talent, and the talent I want is got a soul, a conscience, and real ability, because that's who the people we serve will respond well to. And I want those people to stay and do their best work, and just sits down and says, how do we make this work, folks? They'll do just fine.
I think we're right at the hour. And that's probably a beautiful place to sort of wrap up this conversation. But I know it doesn't really end here. In fact, it didn't begin here. These conversations, again, you've stimulated many of them as a leader in the sector right there on LinkedIn. And I know that with any of those social networks that we post for a variety of reasons, including for visibility, but not just for attention, you have been discussing ideas which are difficult, challenging, and sometimes you've been criticized or interpreted in ways that were all over the place. But it sounds like this is still a very healthy discussion that we can have. And so if people want to reach out to you, they want to learn more about you, what's the best way to engage with you?
I would ask you join me on LinkedIn, and feel free to use messaging to me if there's a subject that you want me to address. That's where I get a lot of my ideas. Some people say to me, how did you know those things? And I say, because I've listened to a lot of people. I see myself as a spokesperson. So I try to listen to my colleagues in the field and then provide back to them what I think the deepest, most accomplished practitioners are looking for.
Well, and I know that this is always a moving target, that you bring this tremendous experience to it, but you're living and navigating all the challenges of this world with us. And so it's great to have your calm, steady, and patient leadership as you're guiding us through that conversation. So thank you so much, Jim.
Pleasure to be with you.
For doing that. It's really a pleasure to have you, and to have everybody here in the room, including behind the lens, occasionally clicking a shutter. That's my son, Jack Frost, who's our producer for this series. And whenever we go live, he has to be there or else the whole world falls apart. So I'm grateful for him too. Grateful for all of you. And if you enjoyed this conversation, I hope you did. Jim is actually coming back to do a CFRE accredited session, so more instructional in nature, later this month. If you want to know when that is, I'm not going to tell you. You're going to have to go to the DonorSearch site at donorsearch.net, look at the resources tab, look for webinars, and check it out there. Because if you are collecting your CFRE credits, if that matters to you, you'll find a whole bunch of classes there you can look at, including his, and that will be a great way for you to gather those credits and be the leader that we all need in this sector. You're also going to find lots of other great sessions, including one coming up later this week with Jim Eskin. That's on Thursday. So if you're looking for your first $1 million donation, you might want to tune in for that. That should be a lot of fun with Jim and everything else this year, where we have podcasts, webcasts like this one, and CFRE accredited sessions. but not always with people like Jim Langley. So my thanks to him, and I'll look forward to seeing all of you maybe in the real world sometime soon. Until then, stay healthy, take care. See you next time. Bye-bye. Bye, everyone. Goes out, and there we go.
You're a terrific interviewer.